last episode of our little history of French Indochina. Episode 26, Geneva. Before we start, I want to say thank you to everybody who listened and who subscribed last 20 or so episodes. And if you have not yet done it, please jump in there to recommend us and give us a rating on the podcast platform, your choice. Again, thank you. Last time, we left off on the smoking ruins of Dien Bien Phu. The camp was captured by the People's Army of Vietnam, and it was massive news that made front pages all around the world. In Vietnam itself, there was a great pride, even among anti-communists. Bui Diem, a nationalist leader whom we talked about before, recounts in his memoirs that even he reluctantly felt pride that Vietnamese like him, even though they were his worst enemies, that those Vietnamese had won decisively against France. For France, this was a catastrophe. Dien Bien Phu was the harbinger of the end of the French colonial empire. This is what the Algerian leader Ferhat Abbas said about the battle at the time. Quote, "It is the affirmation of the Asian and African man in the face of the man of Europe. France lost the only legitimization of its presence, that is to say, the right of the strongest." End quote. The other thing to note is that the Vietnamese victory came at the very moment when the Geneva Conference began, the Indochinese part of negotiation. You remember there was a Korean part and then an Indochina part. Well, the victory could not have been timelier for the Vietnamese delegation. And here let me reiterate something we talked about before, meaning the false impression that the Geneva Conference was a consequence of the battle. No, it had been agreed way back in February, and if you forgot about the reasons why, give another listen to the last episode. That said, the Vietnamese delegation arrived in Geneva with the aura of victory. Claude Chesson, then a senior French civil servant, said, quote, "I will always remember the extraordinary impression of this delegation. It was overwhelming to see them enter the conference room." End quote. What we'll try to understand today then is the discrepancy between the magnitude of the Vietnamese victory and the modest gain at the negotiating table. To say it differently, why the DRV didn't win as much in Geneva as it could have hoped after Dien Bien Phu. To answer that question, the first thing to outline is that there were many competing interests in Geneva. If we focus only on the communist camp, okay, there was a common strategy as we have seen in episode 23. 1953 had been the year when Stalin died, and in the new era, what the Russian and the Chinese wanted more was to calm things down. They wanted to take a breather on the international side of things and deal with their domestic issues. To that end, in Geneva, the Soviet Union let China take the lead when it came to Korea and Vietnam. And the man who took center stage was the Chinese Foreign Minister, Zhou Enlai. Zhou proved to be an effective intermediary between the Vietnamese and the French. And when needed, he used China's decisive support on the battlefield to push the Vietnamese to make concessions. The question is, what did China want? Remember that then in 1954, the People's Republic of China was a very young country, barely 5 years old. And this country, China, had been at war since its creation, first in Korea and then in Indochina. So settling the Indo-Chinese conflict was important, of course, but in doing so, China was doing everything possible to keep the US away from the Chinese zone of influence. And for that purpose, the Vietnamese little brothers had to be reasonable. And that is why the partition of Vietnam was discussed very early, even before the delegations arrived in Geneva. Secondly, to keep the US at bay, the Chinese went against the Indo-Chinese vision of the DRV. The DRV, Ho Chi Minh and his government, wanted to form sort of a communist Indochina with the Pathet Lao in Laos and the Khmer Issarak in Cambodia. But the Chinese wanted to avoid it. Why? Well, to show the US, but also to the new Asian countries such as India or Burma, to show all those people that there was no risk that communism would spread in Asia. So what they recommended was to give a neutral status to Laos and Cambodia. That would reassure the other countries and prevent the Ho Chi Minh government from dominating all of Indochina, which was frowned upon by China, of course. On the other side, remember that the idea of the Geneva Conference had been pushed first by the United Kingdom. The Brits wanted to avoid an internationalization of the conflict at all costs. In that, they did not see eye to eye with their US allies. The United States had reluctantly accepted to come to Geneva, and afterwards, when they get to Geneva, they played hard to get. First, they refused to attend if China was invited. Yep, who lost China? The US were still reeling from the defeat of their Chinese nationalist allies, and they did not recognize the existence of the People's Republic. Dulles and Eisenhower, with the midterm elections in mind, wanted the French to continue the fight with US support. That scenario was great for the US because it allowed them to be firm against communism without putting US boots on the ground like in Korea. In the end, for the US to attend, the Soviets worked out a solution to allow the US to save face. The Chinese were not formally invited to the conference. They were just accompanying the Soviet Union. So to recap, who was in Geneva? Of course, we have the US, France, the UK, and the Soviet Union, plus China and the DRV. Then the associated states of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were there, but nobody thought about them, to be honest. It's on May the 8th, 1954, that the talks began in earnest. And those talks lasted 3 months until the end of July 1954. And I'm going to go very quickly over the first month. During that month, the discussion stalled from the outset because of the French. The French were represented by Foreign Minister Georges Bidault. And Bidault was behaving as if Dien Bien Phu didn't happen. The French demanded that the Vietnamese surrender first before opening any talks. The Americans, as one might expect, supported the French position. And on the other side, the Vietnamese did not surrender, of course. And Pham Van Dong spent most of his time arguing that his communist allies of the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Issarak should be represented there. So you have the main protagonists here, the Vietnamese and the French, seemingly just talking past each other. There were, we know now, secret negotiations between low-level diplomats, but officially there was no contact. Something or someone had to give. And the breakthrough came on June the 12th, when the French government collapsed following a vote of no confidence in the Assemblée Nationale. And that was huge news because suddenly the French foreign minister since 1946, Georges Bidault, the guy who had overseen all the war so far, and who in Geneva had been saying to the Vietnamese, surrender first, guys, then we can talk. Well, Bidault was taken out of the picture from one day to the other. Overnight, he disappeared from Geneva. Both public opinion and the majority of the French parliament wanted an end to the war. which was a position that Bido didn't want. So Bido had to go. And after 7.5 weeks of paralysis in Geneva, the Bido phase of the Geneva Conference and the Bido phase of the Indochina War was over. On June the 18th, a new French government was formed under new Prime Minister Mendes France. And it was a huge turning point because we have seen Mendes France before. He had been a long-time opponent to the war in Indochina. And his priority was to end it. And to prove his point, Mendes France as Prime Minister claimed the foreign affairs portfolio for himself to show that he meant business. Mendes France declared in Parliament that he would resign if he did not reach a ceasefire within 30 days. But if he failed, Mendes France threatened to escalate the war by doubling the number of troops and by asking direct American involvement. And that was a scenario that neither the Brits nor the Chinese wanted to contemplate. So, because of that, negotiations started in earnest, each side ready to make concession to reach an agreement. By the way, no one paid attention to it in Geneva, but there was also a change of prime minister in Bao Dai's government. Bao Dai feared that France might sacrifice his regime, so he sacked his prime minister, Prince Bullock, and appointed someone who had the Americans' ear, our old friend Go Dinzien, the foreign minister of Bao Dai in 1930, who had washed his hands of the Bao Dai solution in 1947. Well, Diem was called back. But the problem of the Associated States of Vietnam in Geneva is that nobody was including it in any negotiations. Or maybe only the US cared about the Associated States. Because what happened after June is that there were now two camps in Geneva. On the one hand, France, the UK, and the three communist countries wanted to reach an agreement. But opposed to them, you had the US. The Americans knew that it could no longer rely on France to continue the war, and that the agreement would be reached at some point. So what they did is to withdraw from the proceedings. Basically, the US stayed, but retreated to the back of the room and just sulked. So the negotiations started in earnest when on June the 23rd, Zhou Enlai, the Chinese minister, secretly met with Pierre Mendes France in Bern, not in Geneva. The two men outlined their positions. One, China said that it would recognize the independence of the kingdoms of Laos and Cambodia and that it would not intervene there if they had assurances that the US would not intervene either. Number two, both parties agreed on the principle of a temporary partition of Vietnam. What remained to be seen was where to put that demarcation line. France said on the 18th parallel, but the DRV wanted to put it on the 13th parallel, that means way south. Number three, the division of Vietnam was intended to be temporary, with elections planned to reunify the country later. After meeting with Pierre Mendes France, Zhou Enlai embarks on a real race for peace. Straight after meeting the French premier, he headed back to Beijing to report to Mao Zedong. But what's very interesting though is that on his way to China, Zhou Enlai made super important stops in Burma and in India. What he did is reassure both Asian heavyweights that they had nothing to fear from Communist China and from the DRV. It was agreed as well that Laos and Cambodia had to remain neutral, meaning non-communist and non-aligned. And on June the 29th, China, India, and Burma signed the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. That document is a precursor of the non-aligned movement. Afterwards, Zhou Enlai stopped in Liuzhou in southern China, where he held a crucial 2-day meeting with Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap, starting on July 3rd. Roux convinced the DRV that an American military intervention was more than likely if the Geneva Conference failed, and that was a catastrophic threat to the DRV's independence and to China's security. He told Ho Chi Minh that the Vietnamese had to compromise. Firstly, the DRV had to abandon his ambition to export communism and accept that Laos and Cambodia be neutralized. Secondly, the DRV had to accept a demarcation line further north of the 13th parallel. And this was a huge sacrifice to move to the 16th or 17th, because it meant that the DRV had to abandon large areas that it controlled since 1946. But the Vietnamese said, okay, if that's what it took to reach a settlement with Pierre Mendès France. So afterwards, Chou Enlai reported back to Mao Zedong, and Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam. The concessions that were discussed, including the division of the 16th parallel, were endorsed by the six-party plenum in July 1954 in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and his Secretary General, Truong Chin, took turns to explain that the armistice was necessary to prevent the American enemy from making the war longer and longer. And think of what we talked about last episode at Dien Bien Phu. The situation was dire in the DRV area, and the DRV had no more appetite for war because the burnout of its population, of its army, was just so acute. After that, Chou Enlai came back to Geneva, and the last phase of the conference started on July the 10th, with a massive sense of urgency because of Mendès France's self-imposed deadline of July the 20th. The clock was ticking, and there was a frenzy of activity until July the 21st, when the Geneva Accords were signed. First, there was an armistice specifying that troops had to regroup on either side of the 17th parallel. The DRV personnel stationed in Laos, Cambodia, and southern Vietnam were to regroup north of the 17th parallel, and the Franco-Vietnamese troops were to regroup south of that same parallel. That had to be done within 300 days. Secondly, an international control commission chaired by India, with Canada and Poland as members, was created to supervise the ceasefire. And finally, elections were scheduled for July 1956 to unify Vietnam under a single administration, either DRV or Associated State of Vietnam. The three agreements were signed on July the 21st, but dated on July the 20th to meet Mendès France's 30-day deadline. The French war in Vietnam was now over. So what happened here? Well, to deny Ho Chi Minh the independence proclaimed on September the 2nd, 1945, France had sent nearly 500,000 soldiers and had lost more than 100,000 men. The toll was more difficult to establish on the Vietnamese side, but it is estimated that 500,000 civilians and soldiers lost their lives. With the Geneva Accords, all that was over. However, neither the Americans nor the Associated State of Vietnam signed the agreements. The US just took note of what happened. And Tran Van Do, Ngo Dinh Diem Foreign Affairs Minister, said that the agreements were not worth the paper they were written on. So that did not bode well for the future. And when the war started again in the 60s, you can see that the breeding ground of all the war was the Geneva Accords. Because what the Geneva Accords settled was just one thing, and one thing only, the French War. The settlement of the Civil War was postponed until 1956, as the partition was supposed to be temporary. In actual fact, Geneva didn't create two states, a South Vietnam and a North Vietnam. those were just zones where the two parties had to regroup their forces until elections. However, the problem was that even though France and the DRV had signed the accords, there was no way to force them to implement the agreements if they decided not to. The DRV was hoping that it would be able to impose its sovereignty over the whole Vietnam when election time came in 1956. However, Gordon Diem was already scheming with the United States to get rid of France and build a South Vietnam. The United States viewed the agreements as a lesser evil. They now had 2 years to help the associated state in the South, and they had nothing to fear from the International Control Commission because they could count on Canada to block anything contrary to the U.S. interests in the Commission. For all those reasons, as soon as the ceasefire was reached, the 17th parallel became a de facto border. There were checkpoints, flags were raised on either sides, you name it. From July 1954 onwards, around 800,000 soldiers, Maori government officials, Catholic, etc., left the north of the 17th parallel to reach the south. Moving in opposite directions, 100,000 or so people left the south to settle in the DRV in the north. And you notice there that 80% of population movements are from the north to the south. That was testament, of course, to the terror inspired by communists. But it must be said that the United States was already working to help Gordon Diem. First, they sent ships to transport refugees from Haiphong to Saigon. Secondly, CIA agents were in the north launching disinformation campaigns to push the masses to flee the communist zone. Edward Lansdale or Tom Dooley are two names that are very famous. It was in this context that the DRV took possession of Hanoi and Haiphong in October 1955. And its priority was to extend and establish its sovereignty over the entire territory, especially in those major cities that it had never controlled. So let us now try to conclude the process of decolonization of Vietnam. And for that, I will focus on the southern zone because this is where the French Expeditionary Corps and its Vietnamese allies were regrouped. In the southern zone, you have a cohabitation between two actors. France, who signed the Geneva Accords, but also the Associated State of Vietnam, who did not sign the Accords. And the Prime Minister Ngo Dinh was working actively to kick France out as soon as possible. At the same time, Ngo Dinh was working to consolidate power for his own benefit. And this process of power grabbing was inseparable from Diem's desire to get rid of France, and it was carried out in several stages. Firstly, Diem received full powers from Bao Dai, which allowed him to take control of the army and make sure that the army was loyal to him. Diem then convinced the Americans to deliver military aid directly to his government and not to France anymore. And from that moment on, he methodically ejected France from Vietnam. On the 20th of July, the Associated State of Vietnam withdrew from the French Union and became the State of Vietnam. In December, Ngo Dinh demanded the withdrawal of all French troops from Vietnam. So all this happened in 1955. Afterwards began a gradual military withdrawal completed by April 1956, when the last French soldiers left Saigon. And that's how a century of French domination came to an end. At the same time, with the help of the Americans, Ngo Dinh got rid of all the French-backed political, religious, or criminal groups. I'm thinking here of the Binh Duen, Cao Dai militias, and the Hoa Hao militias. Violent clashes erupted in Saigon in early 1955, but Diem's army emerged victorious. And from then on, Diem had a tight grip on the power And the American administration fell in love with this anti-communist Ho Chi Minh. Now they had the momentum, Gordon Diem and his clan set out to get rid of the only personality who could still overshadow them, the emperor, Bao Dai himself. And this was a big deal because Gordon Diem was from a family that had served the Nguyen emperors for 1 century. And it was Bao Dai himself who appointed Diem to the position of prime minister. But for Diem, Bao Dai was too close to the French, and that was incompatible with the Vietnam that he wanted to build. So Diem organized a referendum in October 1955, and the Vietnamese voted at 98% to get rid of Bao Dai as head of state, and the republic was proclaimed on the 26th of October 1955. On the same day, Diem declared that there would be no elections to reunify the North and the South, and he definitively buried the Geneva Accords. And on that issue of the referendum, as well as on the rejection of the elections, Gordon Diem received the full support of the Americans. The USA immediately recognized the Republic of Vietnam. France was embarrassed by the turn of events. France had certainly made commitments in Geneva, but the problem was that it didn't have the means to reconvene the Geneva negotiation or to force the Americans and the Vietnamese to organize elections. And you know what? War has started in Algeria, so the French had bigger fish to fry. So Diem was free to do as he wished. And we must emphasize here the extraordinary nature of what Gordon Diem had accomplished. After Geneva, he had inherited a state that had never had any territorial basis, and a state that depended on France for everything. The Associated States Army, for example, was financed and supervised by France. But 2 years later, the Republic of Vietnam had driven France out and asserted its sovereignty over the territory south of the 17th parallel. So this is where we'll stop on the 26th of October 1955, with the proclamation of the Republic of Vietnam. At this date, the French had almost finished their evacuation, and the colonial king Bao Dai had been deposed. The Republic of Vietnam was now cleansed of the opprobrium of collaboration with France. What we had now in the Vietnamese territory were two states who had both turned the page on colonization. However, Diem had refused to participate in any elections to reunify the country. So that left the Vietnamese communists with two options. Either accept the 17th parallel as a de facto border, or take up arms again to create a Democratic Republic of Vietnam on the whole territory. So it was only a matter of time before the Vietnamese Civil War resumed in 1960. But that we will not cover here. If you are interested in what happens in Vietnam after 1956, I would make two recommendations. One, the podcast Inward Empire covers what it calls the Diem's experiment in its episodes 11 to 15, and it does a good job. My second recommendation is the excellent podcast In the Shadows of Utopia. That podcast gives a narrative of Cambodia from ancient times to the modern era, with a focus on the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot's regime. But in doing so, it forays a lot into Vietnamese history and gives a good idea of what happens in Vietnam in the 1960s and the 1970s. Voila! Thank you again for listening. Be well, and for one last time, goodbye.
Jackie.